Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we're going to talk about a genius. The book is called The Genius, and it's how Bill Walsh reinvented football and created an NFL Dynasty. The author, David Harris, is joining us. The book is published by Random House. Thanks for coming by.
Hey, my pleasure.
You know, the book really gives us a close-up, I think, of two things. One, obviously, is Bill Walsh, his tenure as coach and GM of the Niners, and also a close-up of Bill Walsh in a kind of, I would say, warts and all type of way. For example, one of the things that you talk about in the book frequently, because it happens frequently, is the whole notion of quitting. One of the more memorable one is in 1967, when he left the Raiders because it was such a lousy organization. And then he was getting out of football. He had even enrolled in the Stanford Business School. Applied, I'm sorry. Yeah. And that, seemed like a kind of wild way of doing it.
Well, Bill was a driven guy. He was enormously creative. He was high-strung. And one of the aspects to the kind of pressures that he carried with him when he worked in football was he was always looking for the back door out, should that be needed. And I think it gave him the sense that he could leave or might leave, gave him a kind of relief from the pressures of the job that I don't think he could find otherwise. So he always, the entire time he was at the Niners, once he reached that first Super Bowl, from then on there was always talk about quitting.
Yeah, like in 1980, and when they lost 8 straight, he had one foot out the door, which is more understandable than I think the Raiders situation.
Well, he was a guy who could not take losing, ironically. I mean, you think of Bill Walsh as the guy on the sideline who's totally imperturbable.
Mr. Serene.
But in fact, behind the scenes, this was a guy who, 50 years later on his when he was a month away from dying, he was still waking up with memories of a high school football game he coached in his first coaching job that he lost by a single point that he just couldn't get out of his mind and kept looking for ways he could have won that game. So these... every loss stuck with Bill. And nothing rolled off his back on that level.
The other thing about Bill Walsh is that he's different in so many ways. For example, in his coaching approach, when he got into coaching in the NFL, as a head coach at least, there was a coaching style, lots of yelling, lots of boot camp approach. And he said, no yelling, no boot camp. We have to appeal to them on a different level.
Well, he wanted players who performed. He wanted people who could execute when the pressure was on, and he always felt that to do that you had to give people a sense of their own identity in the system, and that you had to not rely on getting them jacked up in order to play. He would say, look, intensity. Everybody in the NFL is intense. You're not going to win a game by being more intense than somebody else. Yeah. You need the intensity. But what wins games is execution. Yeah. It's not the guy who's slobbering there in the fourth quarter looking for somebody to chew up. It's the guy who knows what he's supposed to do, does it without getting flustered, without paying any attention to the huge noise around him or all the pressure. And that's what he was looking for, and that's what he tried to train his players to do.
Yeah, he was looking for flawless execution. I think you used that phrase. And one of the ways that you get that, I guess maybe the only way you get it, is by repetition.
More so than any other coach at the time, he had people repeat and repeat and repeat and drill and drill and drill. And unlike all the other coaches, he insisted all that be done at game speed. He never practiced at half speed. Always practice at game speed.
Oh, my word.
And it worked.
Whew. The other thing, he was different in terms of creating new types of plays, new ways to play the offense, play the defense. Now when you listen to a football game, the announcer says, and they're going into the 5 wide. Isn't that wonderful? Well, he created the 5 wide. He created what's known as the West Coast.
Well, he had a remarkable facility for being able to visualize the field, visualize 22 players on that field, and where each of them would move when one of the others moved. So he had this remarkable capacity that let him just invent plays and invent plays and invent plays. Once when he went out to dinner with his wife, she was standing there waiting for a table, and with Bill had his arm around her, and then she realized that with one hand that was on her shoulder, he was tracing out a play. And finally she turned to him and said, "Did it work?" So this was a guy who could do that, and who brought a remarkable level of innovation. I mean, football was never the same after Bill Walsh introduced his offense. Suddenly, it became not just a game of 100 yards. You had to go 53 yards sideways, too.
Right. Well, like most good books about sports, and this is a very good one, The Genius is full of great stories. We'll try to get David Harris to tell a couple of them when we return.
Find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Spreaker. Jim Foster, Conversations on the Coast. We're also on Twitter at Jim Foster, COC.
The title of our book today on Conversations on the Coast is The Genius. And I really have to immediately follow that by the subtitle. The Genius, How Bill Walsh Reinvented Football and Created an NFL Dynasty. David Harris is the author, Publishers Weekly said in part about the book, Harris's biography is grounded by extensive interviews with Walsh, but the players and others who were there bring nuance to the portrait, revealing that the genius, who was admired for his confident demeanor on game day, could also be a brittle, insecure personality off the field. We were just talking about that at the end of the first segment. Harris clearly knows his football, but the personal drama of Walsh's career is told with such verve that even non-fans will be riveted. And you've done that. You don't have to be a big football fan to like this book.
No, when I originally sold the idea to Random House, I said, look, this is a book women are going to buy for their men and then read themselves.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And it is that kind of book. You don't have to know whether football is blown up or stuffed to appreciate this portrait.
Some of them are and some of them aren't. So much of the genius's impact, I think, is in getting us beyond the serene in-charge guy. The guy that a Los Angeles sports writer said he's got the earphones on, but he's probably listening to Mozart, not to advice from the booth.
Well, there was so much that was missed in that image of Bill Walsh. For example, this was a tough guy. This was a guy who was a boxer,
right?
Who almost became a professional boxer.
And there's a story in there where he floors somebody.
Yeah, well, once when he was
remember that.
An assistant coach at Berkeley, he was driving around in the Berkeley Hills with his wife and another couple in the off season, and some guy passes him in a sports car, cuts him off. Bill honks. The guy flips him the bird. So Bill follows the guy finally into a parking lot, gets out, offers him the opportunity to retract his one-finger salute. The guy who was tall, 6 inches taller than Bill and probably 50 pounds heavier than him, and Bill was no small guy, didn't particularly feel like retracting what he had done. Mm-hmm. So Bill knocked him out right there in that lot. Boom. Got back in the car and drove off. And when he was 65, he got in his last public altercation when he was 65. So this is a guy who
a fighter. Damn it!
This is a fighter. This is not the professor that we all grew used to seeing.
You also have a thumbnail description of him. You say precise, determined, very confident, without ever being cocky.
Yeah, he was. He had a remarkable presence that way, and obviously I explore the issues behind the scenes
sure.
That in his tormentedness in many ways. But you never got a sense of that when you were being coached by him. And you never got a sense of that, of course, when you were watching him play. This was a man who was totally in his element and totally in charge. And that was the phrase that really characterized him. He was a guy who was in charge. He ran everything at the 49ers. And his genius was not just that he invented the West Coast offense. He was also perhaps the best general manager in the history of the National Football League. And he set a whole new model for running a sports franchise as the Niners president. So,
well, he also set a whole new model for draft.
Well,
And I read those sections of your book very carefully about moving up, moving down, moving sideways. I still don't understand what the heck he was doing.
well, what you see is the end product. And he,
Yeah.
in the space of 10 years of running the 49ers draft, drafted 3 players who ultimately became recognized as the best ever to play their positions,
Right.
namely
Right.
Joe Montana, Ronnie Lott, and Jerry Rice.
Jerry Rice.
And show me another general manager in the National Football League who had anything even remotely resembling that kind of success. And his greatest drafts were those not for the great stars, but for those for the journeyman starters
Yep.
that he needed
Yep.
to run his team. I mean, the 86
Plug
draft
this
being,
hole, play that spot.
the 86 draft, was one where he didn't have a draft choice until the draft was 4 years old. He kept trading down and kept trading down, kept trading down, so much so that DeBartolo joked that Bill was trying to get all the picks in the 10th round. And finally he started drafting, and out of that draft he drafted 8 people who became starters, 5 of whom became Pro Bowl players.
Wow.
And, that's a remarkable eye for talent. One little story about his eye for talent was in the early days, of course, when he first showed up there, the Niners were the worst team in football, maybe the worst in the history of football, he says. In any case, to try and find talent, they, among other things, had tryouts down at the headquarters in Redwood City. So here are 400 guys, half of them in work boots or, wearing their souvenir jerseys and all, running under the assistant coaches. And Bill standing up on the fire escape on the second floor watching all these people on the field over there. And after watching for 5 minutes, he turns to John McVay, his right-hand man who was next to him, and says, "See that guy with the curly hair over there? Sign him. He can play." That was Billy Ring, who played for 5 years for the 49ers and became the most inspirational player one year.
He had a sense of humor, and one of the most famous incidents was something that happened in Cincinnati. Can you tell us that one quickly, about him in the uniform and getting the luggage?
Oh, when in the first Super Bowl, when Bill got to Detroit earlier than the rest of the team because he had to stop in Washington to get a Coach of the Year award, and he rented a bellhop's uniform and greeted the team, and nobody recognized him at first, and people were shoving him away, but instead, when they finally learned, they laughed, of course, and it was part of his approach to keeping them loose.
The genius captures Bill Walsh whole, capturing, for example, his innovations beyond the X's and O's. We'll look at that when we come back.
Find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Spreaker. Jim Foster, Conversations on the Coast. We're also on Twitter at Jim Foster COC.
This is Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster. The book today, The Genius, How Bill Walsh Reinvented Football and Created an NFL Dynasty. The author is David Harris. The publisher is Random House, and one of those places that evaluates books called the New York Times Book Review had some nice things to say. It's a rare biography that lives up to its subtitle's lavish claims. What do you think of that? Huh?
Hey, I think you're right.
And it says here that Harris digs beneath Walsh's placid exterior to reveal a seething mass of resentment and insecurity. There you are as the digging psychologist that every biography needs. It's a sports biography that's thorough, diligent, generous, and honest. Can't get more than that. Can't get more than that. I want to get to the innovations that he was involved in beyond the X's and O's aspects, planning, strategy of football. One of those innovations is a man, actually, Dr. Harry Edwards.
Well, he hired Harry before the 1986 season, and his feeling at the time was that the demographics of the league were shifting dramatically. Suddenly, we had entered the age of agents, so the salaries were getting enormous. So there was quite possible you'd have a rookie sitting in a locker room next to a veteran who'd been there for 8 years, and the rookie, who had never played in the NFL before, was making more money than the veteran had made in his entire 8-year career. On top of that, the incoming players were more black than they ever had been.
Right.
And suddenly black players were taking positions that had traditionally been white positions, like linebacker, quarterback,
receiver, running back,
a receiver. There had been some positions where blacks traditionally hadn't played. Now they were playing everywhere. So Bill saw that those changes needed somebody to monitor them, somebody to integrate them, somebody who wasn't in the authority figure that he was, that wasn't making decision about this guy's jobs, but somebody who could just make his office the locker room and help people through that process. And Harry Edwards, who prior to that was best known as the organizer of the Olympic protests in 1968, and was
the fist protest.
Yes, was a sociology professor at UC. Edwards was a brilliant choice, and he is still doing that same function with the Niners today. He's the last holdout of the old Bill Walsh regime at the 49ers.
There's a wonderful story about the good doctor's first contact with little Eddie in the locker room after a game.
Well, he was in there, and basically Eddie threw him out, and told him to get lost, essentially. And this is, it was a visually comic moment, because here's Edwards, who's 6'8", 350 or so, and DeBartolo, who is 5'8", maybe, and 180 pounds. So
nothing but Italian chutzpah.
But then, of course, when Bill informed Eddie, who he had just thrown out of the locker room, Eddie called him the next day, and can I get you something?
Gave him everything.
Yeah,
would you like an office?
Yeah. Do you need more money? In Eddie's usual fashion. So Edwards was a great innovation, and perhaps Bill's greatest contribution was around the issue of black coaches. Mm-hmm. At the time Bill Walsh was head coach, there weren't any black head coaches in the NFL, and he brought that to the attention of the league, as though they didn't know it, saying that he wanted to start an internship program where promising black coaches could come to intern at their training camp, learn the ins and outs of the National Football League to prepare them for head coaching jobs. The NFL, which already had a program which was not really much of anything except an all expense paid tour for some black college coaches.
Come out and watch a few practices.
It was no serious intent to try and prepare people for the NFL. Didn't want Bill's program. So Bill went out and did it on his own with the 49ers. And eventually the league became so impressed that they took it on as their own program. But he probably has more to do with there being a black head coaches than anybody else in football. And his first two graduates are, one just got fired from the University of Washington coaching job, and the other one is coaching the Cincinnati Bengals now. So, he did great things for the issue of racial equality inside the NFL.
One of the interesting things about that story is that he showed great courage. This is something that the league thought they had taken care of with this crummy little thing. And yet he said, no, you haven't.
Walsh was nothing if not courageous.
Yeah.
This was a guy who didn't back off from anything. And while he may have been haunted by demons at part of the time, he was never somebody to back off.
We have to be courageous too. We have to get out of here. The book today, The Genius: How Bill Walsh Reinvented Football and Created an NFL Dynasty. The author is David Harris. And this has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Find us on Facebook, YouTube, and Spreaker. Jim Foster, Conversations on the Coast. We're also on Twitter at Jim Foster, COC.